The letter was written on cheap paper, but the words it carried were the heaviest thing Leanne had ever held. It trembled in her hands, the ink blurring where a tear had fallen moments before. She sat on a dusty wooden bench at the edge of the train platform in Redemption Gulch, Nevada, a place whose name felt like a cruel joke. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the raw, splintery town that rose from the desert floor. It was the summer of 1878, and at 18 years old, she was entirely, terrifyingly alone. Her husband, the man whose photograph she had studied for months, the man who had paid her passage from Guangdong, was not here. The letter, left with the station master, was all she had of him. She could not read the looping English script, but the few words the station master had translated for her, with a mixture of pity and impatience, were enough. Gone. San Francisco. No money. Sorry. Each word was a nail in the coffin of the life she had been promised. She was a widow to a man who was not dead, an orphan in a land that did not want her. The fine silk of her light pink cheongsam, meant for a joyful meeting, was now a mockery. It clung to her in the oppressive heat, its delicate embroidery gathering the grime of the platform. Her slippers, thin and embroidered to match, had been stolen from her luggage on the train. She was barefoot, the hot, rough planks of the platform searing the soles of her feet. The people of Redemption Gulch stared. They did not try to hide it. Rough-faced men in dusty hats, women with pinched faces and sun-scorched skin. They looked at her like she was a strange bird with broken wings, a curiosity to be whispered about before being forgotten. Their words were a low buzz she could not understand, but their meaning was clear in their eyes. You do not belong here. Fear, cold and sharp, coiled in her stomach. She had no money, no food, and knew only a handful of English words learned from a missionary back home. Please, thank you, husband, home. None of them seemed useful now. She folded the letter, the paper soft and fragile, and tucked it back into her sleeve. Crying would do no good. Her father had taught her that. Tears were a luxury, a waste of water the body needed to survive. So she straightened her back, lifted her chin, and stared out at the shimmering heat rising from the tracks that stretched into an endless, empty horizon. She would not let these strangers see her break. A man detached himself from the shadows of the station overhang and walked toward her. He moved with a quiet economy, no wasted steps. He was not like the other men who gawked and muttered. He was tall and lean, dressed in dark, practical clothing that had seen too much sun and too much road. A worn gun belt sat low on his hips, the leather scarred, the handle of the pistol smooth with use. His face was weathered, carved by wind and light, and his eyes, when they met hers, were a startlingly pale gray, the color of a winter sky. They held no pity, but they held no malice either. They simply watched, assessed. He stopped a few feet from her bench. He didn't speak, just looked from her face to the bare feet tucked beneath the hem of her dress and back again. The silence stretched, thicker than the heat. Leanne's heart hammered against her ribs. She had seen men like this in the stories told about America, men whose lives were measured in violence. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. "You're a long way from home." It was not a question. Leanne didn't know how to respond, so she said nothing, her gaze fixed on a crack in the wooden planks. "Station master says your husband lit out for the coast," the man continued. He nodded toward the telegraph office, a small shack buzzing with the frantic clicking of the key. "Left you with nothing but a piece of paper." Leanne flinched. The whole town knew. Of course they did. Her shame was a public spectacle. Before she could think of what to do, another voice cut through the air. this one slick with false courtesy. "Well now, Jasper, don't you know it's rude to bother a lady?" The speaker was a large man, his belly straining the buttons of a once fine waistcoat. His face was fleshy and red, and a thick gold ring glinted on his pinky finger. Two other men, broad-shouldered and dull-eyed, stood behind him. Leanne recognized him from the saloon across the dusty street. She'd seen him watching her from its shaded porch. The man named Jasper didn't turn. His eyes remained on Leanne. "I'm not bothering her, Barlow. Just making conversation." "Is that what you call it?" Barlow chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. He stepped closer, his gaze sweeping over Leanne in a way that made her skin crawl. "Seems to me the little doll is unclaimed property. Her husband defaulted on his contract. I happen to know the man who arranged it. There's a debt owed." Jasper was very still. "She ain't property, Barlow. She's a person." "She's a debt," Barlow corrected, his smile widening, "and I'm a man who believes in collecting what's owed. She can work it off. My place has need for a girl to clean up." The way he said it left no doubt as to what kind of cleaning he meant. His men snickered. The air grew tight. The whispers around the platform died. Everyone was watching. Leanne felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, stripping her bare. This was it. This was the end of her short, foolish journey. She would be swallowed by this harsh, ugly place. Then Jasper moved. It was a small shift, just turning his body slightly to face Barlow more directly, but it changed everything. The lazy calm fell away from him, replaced by something cold and dangerous. "You'll leave her be." Barlow scoffed. "You making a claim, Kane? You don't have two bits to rub together. This girl's contract is worth a hell of a lot more than that." Jasper Kane. The name meant nothing to Leanne, but she saw a flicker of something, recognition, maybe fear, in the eyes of the men behind Barlow. Jasper's pale gray eyes were flat as river stones. "I'm not making a claim. I'm telling you, walk away." For a long moment no one moved. The only sound was the wind whistling around the corner of the station house. Barlow's face darkened, his bravado warring with a sliver of caution. He glanced at the worn pistol on Jasper's hip, then back at his impassive face. He had the numbers, but something in Jasper's stillness gave him pause. This was not a man who made idle threats. With a sneer, Barlow took a half step back. "This ain't over, Kane. You can't watch her forever." He jabbed a thick finger in Leanne's direction. "She's in my town. She'll learn the rules." He turned and lumbered back toward his saloon, his thugs trailing in his wake. The crowd of onlookers, disappointed by the lack of a fight, began to disperse, their murmurs starting up again. The tension broke, but the threat lingered in the air like dust. Jasper turned his attention back to Leanne. The coldness in his eyes had receded, replaced by that same unsettling watchfulness. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she saw a flicker of something she couldn't name. It wasn't kindness. It was something harder, something forged in a place just as lonely as the one she was in now. He gestured with his chin toward the end of the street, away from the saloon. "You can stay here and wait for him to come back," he said, his voice low and even. "Or you can come with me. I can't promise you pretty, but I can promise you'll see the sun come up tomorrow." It was not a rescue. It was a choice, stark and simple. Trust the silent, dangerous man, or trust the loud, greedy one. One offered a vague threat of tomorrow. The other promised a definite, ugly today. Leanne looked at Jasper Kane's weathered face, at his steady hands, and then at the swinging doors of the saloon where Marcus Barlow had disappeared. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, what awaited her there. Slowly, She stood up on her sore, dirty feet. She gave a single, sharp nod. It was the only answer she had. Jasper didn't smile. He simply turned and started walking. Leanne hesitated for only a second before she followed, her small, barefoot steps falling into the rhythm of his long, deliberate stride, away from the station and into the heart of a town that had already decided to devour her. They walked in silence through the dusty main street of Redemption Gulch. People stopped to stare, their faces a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. A white gunslinger and a barefoot Chinese girl in a pink silk dress. They were a spectacle, an affront to the town's harsh, unwritten rules. Leanne kept her eyes down, focusing on the back of Jasper's worn leather vest, using it as a shield against the hostile glances. He seemed oblivious to them, his gaze fixed forward, his stride never faltering. He led her past the saloon, the general store, and the assayer's office. At the far end of town, where the buildings grew smaller and more dilapidated, he stopped in front of the livery stable. The air was thick with the smell of hay, manure, and horse. Jasper spoke briefly to a stooped, elderly man who was mending a piece of tack. The old man glanced at Leanne, his expression unreadable, then nodded and took a coin from Jasper. Jasper led her up a rickety set of external stairs to a small room above the stables. The room was sparse, containing only a narrow cot, a small table with a wash basin, and a single window that looked out over the corrals. But it was clean, and the door had a sturdy wooden bolt on the inside. It was a sanctuary. "You'll be safe here for the night," Jasper said, his voice filling the small space. He didn't enter, just stood in the doorway. "Bolt the door after me. Don't open it for anyone." He left and returned a few minutes later with a bucket of water, a piece of coarse soap, and a bundle wrapped in brown paper. He set them just inside the door. "There's food in the parcel, and these." He nudged a second, smaller bundle with his boot. "They're not new, but they're better than nothing." Leanne unwrapped it. Inside was a pair of boys' leather boots, scuffed and worn, but solid. They would be too big, but they were the kindest thing anyone had shown her since she'd set foot in this country. She looked up at him, her throat tight. "Thank you," she whispered, the English words feeling small and inadequate. He just nodded, his expression unchanging. His gaze lingered on her for a moment, then he pulled the door closed, his footsteps receding down the stairs. Leanne slid the heavy bolt into place. The sound of it clicking home was the first feeling of security she'd had all day. She washed her face and feet, the cool water a balm on her hot, aching skin. The bread and dried meat in the parcel were plain, but to her they were a feast. As she ate, she thought about the man named Jasper Kane. He was not gentle. He was not kind in the way the missionaries had been. His kindness was practical, hard-edged. He hadn't offered comforting words. He had offered a locked room, food, and shoes. In this place, she was beginning to understand, those things were worth more than all the pleasantries in the world. But she also knew Barlow's words hung in the air. This ain't over. Jasper had bought her a night's reprieve, not a future. What would happen tomorrow? Where could she possibly go? As dusk settled over the desert, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, Leanne felt a fresh wave of despair. She had escaped the fire, but she was still trapped in the frying pan. The next morning Jasper returned. He brought a tin cup of what he called coffee. It was black, bitter, and hot. Leanne drank it gratefully. "Barlow's been asking questions," he said without preamble, leaning against the doorframe. "Talking to the railroad agent. Spreading the word that you're an indentured servant, that your husband sold your contract to cover his debts." Leanne's blood ran cold. "No," she said, shaking her head. "Not true." "Doesn't matter if it's true," Jasper said, his voice flat. It's a story people here will believe. A man like Barlow, he owns the sheriff. He owns the judge. He can make any story true if he says it enough times." He looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face. "That letter your husband left. May I see it?" Hesitantly, Leanne retrieved the folded paper from her sleeve and handed it to him. He unfolded it carefully. She watched his eyes scan the English words, his expression grim. Then he surprised her. He pointed to the column of Chinese characters written down the side, a postscript from the matchmaker who had arranged everything. "What does this part say?" he asked. Leanne was stunned. You cannot read it?" A faint, wry twist touched his lips. "My talents are limited. Tell me." She looked at the familiar characters, a sudden ache of homesickness rising in her. "It says, 'The contract is with my husband, Wei. It says if he cannot provide, the debt is void. I am free.'" Jasper was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the letter. "The matchmaker put that in to protect you. But your husband, Wei, he didn't translate that part for the agent here. He just showed them the part about you being bound to him." He folded the letter and handed it back to her. "He didn't just abandon you. He sold you." The words hit her like a physical blow. It was worse than she had imagined. Not just carelessness, but deliberate cruelty. He had used her, taken the money for her contract, and left her to be collected like a piece of freight. "This changes things," Jasper said. "Barlow thinks he has a legal claim. He'll come with the law on his side." What can do?" Leanne asked, her voice trembling. "You have two choices," he said, and she was reminded of his words at the station. He was a man who saw the world in stark, hard choices. "You can let him take you, or we can leave, right now. We ride north, into the territory. We find a place so far off the map that Barlow's reach can't find you." "We?" she asked, the word catching in her throat. "I made myself his business when I stepped in yesterday," Jasper said, a hint of resignation in his tone. "My time in this town is done either way. Question is, are you coming with me?" Before she could answer, heavy footsteps pounded up the wooden stairs. There was a loud bang on the door. "Jasper Kane, open up! This is the law!" Jasper's hand went instinctively to the butt of his pistol. He looked at Leanne, and in his eyes she saw the choice laid bare. There was no more time for talk. He moved to the small window, peering down into the livery yard. "It's the deputy, and Barlow's with him. They've got a piece of paper." The banging came again, louder this time. "Open the door, Kane, or I'll kick it in." "He'll do it," Jasper said quietly. He looked at Leanne, his face grim. "Once that door opens, your choice is made for you." Leanne's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She looked at the door, then back at Jasper. He was a stranger, a man with a gun and a past he didn't speak of. But he was also the only person who had looked at her and seen a human being instead of an object. To go with him was to leap into an unknown darkness. To stay was to be dragged into a darkness she understood all too well. She thought of her father, of his lessons in quiet endurance. But this was not a time for endurance. This was a time for defiance. She took a deep breath and gave Jasper a firm, decisive nod. Her choice was made. Jasper's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, respect perhaps, passed through his eyes. He moved away from the window. "Stay away from the door," he ordered. He drew his pistol, the sound of the metal clearing the leather scabbard shockingly loud in the small room. He didn't point it at the door, but held it ready at his side. The door shuddered as a heavy boot slammed against it. Wood splintered. Another kick, and the bolt tore from the frame. The door swung inward, crashing against the wall. A portly deputy with a drooping mustache and a sweat-stained shirt stood there, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. Behind him, Marcus Barlow grinned, a roll of paper clutched in his fist like a scepter. "Kane," the deputy wheezed, trying to sound authoritative, "you are interfering with the lawful collection of property." "She's not property, deputy," Jasper said, his voice dangerously calm. "And you're not the law. You're just Barlow's errand boy." The deputy's face reddened. Barlow stepped forward, waving the paper. "I have a writ of indenture, signed and sealed. The girl belongs to me until her husband's debt is paid. Now stand aside." "That paper's a fraud," Jasper stated. "That's for a judge to decide," Barlow sneered. "And the judge in this town happens to be a good friend of mine. Now give me the girl." He gestured to Leanne, who stood pressed against the far wall. It was then that Leanne did something that surprised them all, including herself. She stepped forward, out from behind the meager protection of the cot. She held up the letter from her husband. Her hand was shaking, but her voice was clear. "No," she said, the single English word ringing with defiance. She pointed to the Chinese characters on the page. "This paper is truth. I am free." Barlow laughed. "What is that, your grocery list? Nobody here reads that chicken scratch. This," he shook his writ, "is the only paper that matters in Redemption Gulch." He took a step into the room. Jasper moved to block him. "That's far enough, Barlow." "You going to shoot an unarmed man in front of a lawman, Kane?" Barlow taunted. "I don't think so. Your days a gun player behind you, or so I hear." A shadow crossed Jasper's face. It seemed Barlow knew more about him than he'd let on, but his resolve didn't waver. "I might be retired," Jasper said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "but I'm not dead." He holstered his pistol. The move was so unexpected that everyone froze. Then, in a motion too fast to follow, his left hand shot out and grabbed the front of Barlow's waistcoat, yanking him forward. With his right, he snatched the writ from Barlow's hand. "Hey!" the deputy shouted, fumbling to raise his shotgun. Jasper ignored him. He held the writ up to the light from the window, his eyes scanning it quickly. "You're getting sloppy, Barlow," he said. "This signature from the territorial clerk? It's a forgery, a bad one. The real clerk makes his T with a loop. You just drew a straight line." He crumpled the paper into a ball and tossed it onto the floor. "This document isn't worth the spit it would take to burn it." Barlow's face was purple with rage. "You have no proof." "Don't I?" Jasper released him, shoving him back toward the doorway. "I sent a telegraph to the marshal's office in Carson City last night. Gave them your name and the name of the clerk you've been paying off. I imagine a U.S. Marshal will be very interested to compare this signature with the ones on file. He might even be interested in your little business of importing and selling people." The color drained from Barlow's face. The deputy looked from Barlow to Jasper, sudden panic in his eyes. He was just a town lawman. A U.S. Marshal was another matter entirely. "You're bluffing," Barlow stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Jasper asked softly. "You've built your little kingdom on fear, Barlow, but your greed finally made you reach too far. You should have left her alone." Barlow stared at Jasper, his mind racing. He looked at the crumpled writ, at the nervous deputy, and at the unyielding face of the man before him. He had miscalculated. He had thought Jasper Kane was just a washed-up drifter. He had been wrong. Without another word, Barlow turned and pushed past the deputy, clattering down the stairs. The deputy hesitated for a second, then scurried after his master. Silence returned to the little room, broken only by the sound of Leanne's ragged breathing. It was over. The immediate danger had passed. Jasper turned to her. The tension slowly eased from his shoulders. "We still need to leave," he said. "The marshal won't get here for days, maybe weeks. Barlow's cornered, and a cornered rat is the most dangerous kind. He won't let us just walk out of here." He looked out the window. "We'll have to go tonight, after dark, and we won't be taking the main road." 3 months later, the dust of Redemption Gulch was a distant memory. The air in the high meadows of the Ruby Mountains was clean and cool, smelling of pine and damp earth. Jasper had been right. They had ridden hard for 3 nights, sticking to hidden trails and dry creek beds, until the oppressive heat of the desert gave way to the green promise of the mountains. Here, in a small, forgotten valley, they had found their place. It was a small cabin, abandoned by a prospector who had given up his search for gold. They had filed a claim on the quarter section under the Homestead Act, using the last of Jasper's money to pay the fees in a town 2 days' ride away. The place was theirs, earned with sweat and sealed with federal paper. Life was hard, but it was honest. Jasper taught Leanne how to mend a fence, how to read the clouds for rain, and how to gather wild onions and berries. In turn, she showed him how to set snares for rabbits, a skill learned in her village, and how to make a little go a long way in their cooking pot. She planted a small garden behind the cabin, coaxing stubborn life from the rocky soil. The seeds, purchased with the money from the sale of her silk chong sam in that distant town, were more precious to her than gold. Her English improved daily. They spoke in the evenings, sitting by the fire, the vast, silent darkness of the mountains around them. He never spoke of his past, of why a man who knew so much about forged documents and U.S. Marshals lived the life of a drifter. And she never asked. His secrets were his own, just as her past was hers. What mattered was the here and now, the solid reality of the cabin, the growing garden, the shared work. One afternoon, a traveling merchant stopped by, his wagon laden with goods. He brought news from the south. He spoke of a man named Barlow in Redemption Gulch who had been arrested by a U.S. Marshal for fraud and trafficking. His entire enterprise had crumbled, taking the town's deputy and a territorial clerk down with him. Justice, it seemed, had finally found its way to the desert. Leanne felt a quiet sense of release, the last dark thread connecting her to that place finally severed. Later that evening, as she prepared to light the fire for their supper, she paused. She went to a small wooden box where she kept her few possessions and took out the letter from Way, the one she had carried from the train station. Its edges were frayed, the paper as soft as old cloth. For months it had been a symbol of her shame and abandonment. She looked at it for a long moment, at the looping English script and the familiar Chinese characters. She was no longer the girl who had cried on that platform. She was a woman who could mend a fence, grow her own food, and look a stranger in the eye. She was a survivor. Without ceremony, she crumpled the letter and tucked it into the kindling. It caught quickly, the words of betrayal and sorrow turning to orange flame, then gray ash. The fire it started would cook their meal. The object that had marked the end of one life now gave warmth and sustenance to a new one. Jasper came in from tending the horses and saw her watching the flames. He said nothing, but he knew what she had done. He walked over to the hearth and stood beside her. He had laid aside his gun belt when they started building their homestead. He was still watchful, still quiet, but the hardness in his eyes had softened, weathered into something like peace. He looked at her, at the firelight playing on her face, and saw not a fragile doll, but a woman as strong and resilient as the mountain pines outside their door. A quiet understanding passed between them, a truth that needed no words. Sometimes a life didn't begin with a promise kept, but with a promise broken. And sometimes the place you were meant to be was the one you never expected to find, a quiet harbor built together, piece by piece out of the wreckage of the past. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.